Nimrod, it means rebel, was a great-grandson of Noah, and he was a mighty warrior on the earth. At this time, mankind had one common language, but instead of obeying God's command to spread throughout the earth, they stopped at a fertile plain that was called Shinar, or Babylon.
Let us build a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens. We will make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the earth. The great Nimrod will lead us. Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly to build this great structure, and we will use the tar that is here for mortar.
We need no God to rule over us, nor do we need the ancient rules of my great-grandfather Noah. This great city will be the center of the earth. All people can come here to worship.
And Nimrod will rule over us. He will be our ruler and our high priest. He is God.
So, construction began on the new center of worship. They began to build a great tower to touch heaven itself. Most likely this was a large ziggurat where they could worship stars and created things rather than the Creator himself. The Lord came down to see both the city and the tower that the men were building.
If as one people they have begun to do this, then nothing will be impossible for them. Let us confuse their language so they will not be able to understand each other.
It wasn't long before the confusion of speech began to set in.
Faire de la place pour de la tueuse à record de la todos Dieu. Was sagst du, idiot? Nu putza, intellexe, s'espion. Quit speaking that strange tongue! Get out of my sight! Hey, what is going on? Don't you understand me?
Those who spoke new languages could only understand each other. As a result, work on the tower stopped, and the people scattered throughout the earth, as God intended.
am funny weird because I like genealogies. In fact, let me go further. I love genealogies. But the reason I love genealogies is because there is so much information that if you don't study the genealogies, you don't understand the Bible. Plain and simple. I'll go a little bit further. I believe that if a pastor does not understand the genealogies in the Old Testament, they probably shouldn't be a pastor. That's how much information is in the genealogies. So let me blow your mind. Did you know that Noah and his 3 sons were still living when all of these different languages in different nations came into existence? Did you know that? It's true, and I'm going to prove it to you. How long did Noah live after the flood? Anyone? How long did he live after the flood? Take a guess. I can't hear you. 800 years. No. 400 years. Getting closer. 350 years. Look at Genesis chapter 9, verses 28 and 29. And Noah lived after the flood 350 years. There's a direct answer. We don't even have to calculate it. It tells us. It states it very plainly. Noah lived after the flood 350 years, and all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So he lived for 950 years, 350 years after the flood, and if you remember, he was 600 years old when the flood began. So we know all of that information. Now, let's take a quick look at the genealogy of Shem, one of Noah's 3 sons. Who were the 3 sons of Noah again? Japheth, Ham, Shem. So what I want to do is I want to look at the genealogy of Shem. It's going to go into more depth. In fact, it's going to use the very same pattern as the genealogy of Noah in Genesis chapter 5. And the reason it's going to use the very same pattern is because it's going to trace the genealogy from Shem to Abraham. Now remember, we don't really care about the other parts or branches of the family tree. We're only concerned when we were going from Adam to Noah. Now we're going to be concerned from Noah to Abraham. Now there is a place, because we want to know the history of the nations. And actually Genesis chapter 10 is called the Table of the Nations. We know where all of the nations came from. And the reason we know that is because of the Bible. Here's what's interesting. And even those who do not believe in the Bible are blown away when they study Genesis chapter 10. And they study all of the different nations of the world, because you can go back then, and this is considered to be, quote, prehistory. Before things were actually written down, we know where the nations came from. And when they take a look at that, they go, oh my gosh, that is so accurate. Now I'm getting off. But let's take a quick look at the genealogy of Shem, who is one of Noah's 3 sons. And as we read his genealogy, I want you to follow along with the chart that's going to be on the back wall. How many of you remember this chart? It is a great chart. And what we're going to do is we're going to skip, let me turn this around, Adam to Noah, because we've already gone through that. Here's where Adam died. Now remember when the flood occurred. The flood occurred in the year what? 1656, when Noah was 600 years old. Here is Noah. He was born 1056, right before Adam died, or right after Adam died. And here he is. And then we know Noah was 600 years old when the flood began. Actually, the flood occurred 1656 years after Adam was created. We know that specifically because Genesis chapter 5 tells us in the genealogies. So, let's start reading in Genesis chapter 11. We're going to read verses 10 through 11. Now, this is not the genealogy of Abraham that I talked about Sunday. We'll study that when we get to Abraham. Very interesting. I just want to show you where the different nations came from and the different languages, and why the story of the Tower of Babel is so important. All right? So, let's read verses 10 through 11. This is the account of Shem. 2 years after the flood, when Shem was 100 years old. Now, you got to remember, they're not going to count the flood. They're going to count it when the flood began. So, Shem was 98 years old when he entered the ark. 2 years after the flood, he has Arphaxad. So when Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arphaxad. Now, if you notice on this, it says something a little bit different. It says Arphaxad. But the reason it does is because it's going after the King James Version. This is probably a more literal translation that I'm using. So when I say Arphaxad, we're talking about the same person. But I want you to notice, Shem was 100 years old. See this right here, 100? He was 100 years old when he had Shem. So Shem was born in the year 1658, 2 years after the flood occurred. And after he became the father of Arphaxad, Shem lived, get this, 500 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Lots of sons and daughters. But we're not interested in those branches of the family tree because we're only interested in tracing it to Abraham, right? We found out when we were tracing from Adam and he had Seth. Adam had a lot more children, a lot more sons than just Seth. Why were we only interested in Seth? Because we were only interested in tracing it to Noah, to the flood, the person who's going to be saved. We're going to only be interested in now tracing it from Noah to Abraham because through Abraham, all of the nations on the earth are going to be blessed. Through Abraham, the Messiah is going to come. Everyone with me? But we know about when the Tower of Babel occurred. How many of you didn't know that? Wow. So let's keep going. Now look at verses 12 and 13 up on the screens. When Arphaxad had lived 35 years, he became the father of Shelah. So let's trace this down. We've got Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he had Arphaxad. When Arphaxad, can you see that back there? You guys can't. I'm sorry. But when he was 35 years old, he had Shelah. And after he became the father of Shelah, Arphaxad lived 403 years, and he had other sons and daughters. How many sons and daughters? Lots of sons and daughters. But we're not interested in their family tree or that branch of the family tree because we're only interested in tracing it to Abraham. Now look at verses 14 and 15. When Shelah had lived 30 years. So we're able to calculate all of these years and what year it was from the time Adam was created. I mean, he's telling us how old he was when he had this son, how long that he lived, and when he died. And when this son was born, he lived this long before he had this son and this long afterwards and when he died. So we're getting all of this information. Now let's read verses 16 through 17. When Eber had lived 34 years, he became the father of Peleg. Eber lived 430 years and had other sons and daughters. So now we come down all the way. This is Eber. Eber was 34 years old when he had Peleg. When was Peleg born? In the year 1757 after Adam was created. 1757 years after Adam was created. That's how specific the Bible is. That's pretty specific, isn't it? Now, I'm going to stop at Peleg. Why am I going to stop at Peleg? Does anyone know? We're going to stop at Peleg because most scholars believe that the story of the Tower of Babel occurred right before he was born. Next week, we'll find out what the etymology of the word Peleg is. And we're going to find out that he was named Peleg because of the Tower of Babel and the events that occurred at that time. So we know that somewhere around the time that Peleg was born, the Tower of Babel occurred. But I want you to notice when he was born. He was born in the year 1757 after Adam was created. Now, the flood occurred in what year? I've already told you. 1656. Write that down. The flood occurred in the year 1656 after Adam was created. Now, later on, as we're studying and we're getting to Joseph, we're going to turn around. Because the Bible is reckoning time from the day that Adam was created. But we don't do that today. We reckon time from the time of Christ, and we go backwards. So they go from Adam forwards and we go backwards, but what we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to come to a common event, see what the date is, and we can go all the way out and find out when Adam was created. Wow. Did you know that? We can do that because the Bible is that specific. And now we're finding out through archaeology, everything that the Bible says can be verified. Very interesting. But the flood occurred in 1656. Peleg was born in 1757. Subtract 1656 from 1757, and what do you get? Oh, come on. 101. Did everyone get 101? You're a math professor, John. What'd you get? 101. So approximately 100 years after the flood, the Tower of Babel occurred. So, 100 years after the flood, we've got these people wanting to build this tower in Genesis chapter 11. So the question I have to you, was Noah still alive? Was he there to see the Tower of Babel being built? Yes. How do we know that? Because Noah lived 350 years after the flood, and the Tower of Babel occurred approximately 100 years after the flood. So he lived until the year 2006. So was Shem, Arphaxad, Shelah, and Eber? How's that? Actually, Hebrew comes from the word Eber, but that's another story. And Eber, were they still alive? Yes, 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 and yes. They were all alive. Wow. Now, we don't know if Japheth and Ham, who were the other two sons of Noah, were still alive because we're not told how long they lived. Why were we not told how long they lived? Because in Genesis chapter 10, we're getting a list of the nations, a table of the nations, and where they went and settled. But we're not given the times. Why? Because we're not interested in that branch or those branches of the family tree. They don't go to Abraham. But we are interested in the nations they create. So we don't know if Japheth and Ham were still alive because we're not told how long they lived. But we assume that they lived just as long as Shem did, as well as their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren, etc. But here's my point. By the third generation after Noah, we are told that there are different nations and different languages. In other words, by the time that Japheth had grandsons, there were multiple languages on the earth. But we're also told that Noah and his three sons are still alive at that time. So how could you have different nations in different languages just 100 years after the earth? Just after the flood. How could you do that? How could you have different nations in different languages after just 100 years from the flood? Well, that's why the story of the Tower of Babel is inserted. It's inserted to explain why there were different nations and different languages in such a short time and how they came into existence. If we can trace everyone back to Noah, and we see these three sons, and we see all of us as being descendants of these three sons, and we think, well, why do we have all of these different languages, and why are our cultures so different? Well, that's a good question. But I have a better question. If the Tower of Babel occurred just 100 years after the flood, somewhere in there, why do we have different nations and different languages? The Bible tells us. So it inserts the story of the Tower of Babel. Now, in our Western culture, we don't recognize why the Tower of Babel or the story of the Tower of Babel was inserted because there was no transitional statement. And without a transitional statement, we have a hard time following the storyline. Why? Because it's a cultural thing. You see, in our Western civilization, we use transitional statements to help people follow the train of thought. In other words, we use segues. Does everyone understand what I mean by segues? A segue in communication is a transitional statement to help you make a smooth transition from one subject to another so you can follow a person's train of thought. Men, we have a hard time with the conversations that women have because they don't use segues. They'll be talking about one thing and immediately go to something else, a totally different subject, and every woman in the room understands that, and men are lost. I thought we were talking about this. Keep up with us. See, women are a lot like the Middle Eastern culture. They don't use segues. The second thing you need to know is who instigated the building of the Tower of Babel and why. You see, to understand the story of the Tower of Babel, you have to understand the person behind the story. If you don't understand the person behind the story, the Tower of Babel makes no sense. Not only that, as we begin to go through the New Testament, it'll keep referring to the same person. And we don't understand why. You see, if you don't understand the Old Testament, you're going to miss out a lot of things in the New Testament. So to understand the story of the Tower of Babel, you have to understand the person behind it. And who's the person behind the Tower of Babel? Most of you know. Starts with an N. His name is Nimrod. Yes, the grandson of Ham. So let's talk about Nimrod. As I said, Nimrod was the grandson of Ham. We'll find out why that's important next week. But that is very important. You didn't think genealogies were important. They're very important. And we'll explain why and how it affected him so greatly. Turn to Genesis chapter 10, verse number 6. We're going to jump down to verses 8 through 10 after we read verse 6. It says, the sons of Ham, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Now jump down to verses 8 through 10. Cush was the father of Nimrod. Now, Nimrod is the only person in this table of nations that they're really going to elaborate on. That means he's very important. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who grew to be a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first sinners of his kingdom, very important, were Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. Now, let me explain the etymology of the name Nimrod. Nimrod is translated, or should I say, and I should say, transliterated from the Hebrew word Nimrod, and it literally means rebellion, or to rebel. Now I want you to notice that Nimrod is referred to as mighty 3 times. He was a mighty warrior, and twice he's referred to as a mighty hunter. Now, the word mighty is translated from the Hebrew word Gibor. Gibor means one who rules with violence, or a tyrant who kills without mercy. So verse number 8 is saying that Nimrod was a warrior who ruled with violence. He was a hunter who killed without mercy. Now, the word hunter does not mean that he was hunting wild game. Now, if he wasn't hunting wild game, what was he hunting? Men. Nimrod was a hunter of men. You see, verse number 9 is elaborating on verse 8, and you don't really understand that unless you're reading it through the Hebrew. Nimrod was a mighty warrior. He hunted men. That's why those 2 verses are put together. That's what those 2 verses are telling you. And that's how he became a king over a kingdom. He conquered people. How many of you saw the movie Conan with Arnold Schwarzenegger? Do you remember the beginning of it? Man, they came into this city and they just plundered. That was literally the way Nimrod was. Now, notice in verse 8 that it says he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, most of us read that and we go, oh, he was a good man. No, he wasn't. Underline the word before. The word before is translated from the Hebrew word panim, and it implies hostility. So what this is saying is that Nimrod was a violent man. He was a man who hunted other men. And he killed without mercy, and he was in rebellion to God, openly hostile towards God and his laws. Now remember the Noahide laws. One of the Noahide laws, in fact it's the 7th one, says if any man takes another person's life, his life is to be taken. But Nimrod rebelled against that, and he hunted men. And because he was such a mighty warrior, they were afraid of him. They submitted to him. People didn't rise up against him. And he was very proud that he hunted men, and he was able, because of his force and his power, to conquer these cities and bring them underneath his rule. Just 100 years after the flood. Now I want you to notice where his kingdom was. Look in verse number 10. We're still in Genesis chapter 10, remember. We're looking at the table of the nations. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon. Now what does it mean, first centers? Because this was the first kingdom that he actually set up. He took these cities, he put them together in their mind, and he continued to go out and conquer. He had this vision of having a first world empire. Does that make sense? But the first center of his kingdom were Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. Now I want you to notice where his kingdom was. It was in the land of Shinar, which was where the Tower of Babylon was built. Turn to Genesis chapter 11. Let's read verses 1 and 2. These are the first two verses of the story of the Tower of Babel. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech, one dialect. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. These two verses I told you were the beginning of this story, the Tower of Babel. So the land of Shinar was where the Tower of Babel was being built. And the king over that kingdom was Nimrod. So he's the one who's behind the Tower of Babylon. Scholars refer to Genesis chapter 10 as the Table of Nations. And the reason they do that is because it gives a broad history of the different nations and where they migrated to and how they are related to each other. So let's take a look at the map on the back wall. And let me just kind of explain this. Can we put the map? There it is. This is the Mediterranean Sea. Notice it says that. This is the Red Sea. This is the Gulf of Aqaba. In fact, that's a beautiful place. In fact, that's the Sinai Peninsula. This is the Red Sea. This is the sea that the children of Israel, this is Egypt right here, they crossed over the Red Sea. They went to Mount Sinai, and that's about right down in here. And then if you ever go to Egypt with me, we'll go to Mount Sinai. Then we'll sail up the Gulf of Aqaba, the most clear waters you've ever seen. In fact, I'd like to take a day off and just scuba dive there. It's one of the best places, the Gulf of Aqaba on the Red Sea. One of the best places. Have you scuba dived there? It's just gorgeous. You've been there. It is just absolutely stunning. I've been to the Caribbean. I've scuba dived in the Caribbean. It's supposed to be great there. Let me tell you, it's nothing like the Red Sea. It's nothing like the Gulf of... It's just unbelievable. That's the only way I can explain it. Chapter 10 tells us that Noah had 3 sons. And then it begins to list all of the sons that came from them, and these created 70 nations. So what you actually had was, see Ham? The sons of Ham migrated to Africa. So those from Africa can take themselves directly back to Noah through Ham. Japheth came in, and this is Japheth right here. He literally, from up to Russia, all the way over to Europe. So the majority of us can trace our roots all the way back to Japheth and then to Noah. Does that make sense? Because most of us came from that European ancestry. And then you had Shem. Shem is the son that's going to trace his genealogy down to Abraham. Shem is over here, the Arabic people. So what's going to take place is from Shem, and the reason we call this the Orient is because Shem came down and settled in this place through here that we consider to be the Orient and over towards China. So there's a common descent there. They can trace their roots all the way back to Shem. And so when you go over to Israel in the Middle East, it's considered to be part of the Orient. And what's interesting is those who study anthropology, those who study that, will go back and they go, that is remarkably close. And they can see how all of these people took their characteristics, all of these traits that we have, and you can trace it all the way back, and then you go, wait a minute, it comes back to, looks like 3 different people to one. And we're getting this. So, in chapter 11, the first 9 verses, we have the Tower of Babel to explain. The whole purpose of the story is to explain how the different nations and different languages came into existence in such a short time. After that story, and the only way it could happen is a miraculous work. And after that story, beginning in verse 10 of chapter 11, we then have the genealogy of Shem, which takes us to Abraham, so we will know exactly when Abraham was born in relationship to when Adam was created. The Bible is very specific. So in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, we're going to cover a period of about 2,000 years. Adam to Abraham. Wow. Now, to cover the next 2,000 years from Abraham to Jesus, it's going to take the rest of the book of Genesis plus 38 more books. And the Old Testament only has 39 books. So in the first 11 chapters, we covered a period of 2,000 years. We looked at all of the major events, and the whole purpose of going through these major events is to get us to one person, Abraham. Because through Abraham, we're going to see the seed of the woman that was promised at the fall fulfilled. And we're going to see all of the nations on the earth, very important. We're going to trace it back all the way to Genesis chapter 10 and say, all of the nations of the earth are going to be blessed through this one man because he obeyed God in a time that was very, very unholy, in a time that had been affected by Nimrod, in a time where God literally had to come in and confuse the languages, and because he confused the languages, it scattered the people. And here's what's interesting, and I might delve into this if I have time. That's why archaeologists go back and they go, we don't understand this. There's the Stone Age. Now, we want to say the Stone Age was millions of years ago, but when we start going under the layers, we get back from these layers, tails. If you're into archaeology, you'll see these places tails, and they go from one layer to the next, and they get to this place, and they say it's a Stone Age, and they go, well, it doesn't look that far back. But the reason it doesn't is because when he scatters them, they can't speak. All of a sudden, all of the other people who had these skills, they're without them. So the first thing they have to do when they scatter among each other, because they can't communicate, and it becomes very, everyone's very fearful. So they stay in their own clans and they begin to migrate and go, and then they have to actually learn these things on their own. So it's almost like starting over, and here they are, Stone Age. And now archaeology is going back and they're beginning to see this in the different levels, and they're going, it wasn't as far back as they want to tell you it was. And you know what they're doing? Now a lot of the archaeologists have turned into the Bible, and they're using it as one of their maps to be able to find out what's happening. In fact, if you go back to Israel, we'll go to a place called Dan. We can take a coin that goes all the way back to Abraham. And it literally has on there certain inscriptions from the period of the time that the Bible talks of these kings that were around it. Oh my gosh, people, exactly what the Bible said. And just 50 years ago, they were saying the Bible was, you have to discredit, it doesn't mean anything. And now they're coming and going, it's right on.